Imagine the scene. It is the 1st century. A letter from the Apostle Paul has just arrived in the Roman colony of Philippi. The believers gather in a crowded home. The reader stands in the center of the room, unrolling the parchment. For several minutes, the room is filled with beautiful, soaring theology. The letter speaks of Christ emptying himself. It speaks of pressing on toward the goal. It speaks of rejoicing in the Lord always. The congregation is encouraged. The atmosphere is warm. It is, by all accounts, Paul's most joyful letter. He does not write to the Philippians with the fierce correction he used for the Galatians, or the heartbroken frustration he directed at the Corinthians. And then, the reader reaches chapter 4. Suddenly, the soaring theology stops. The general encouragement narrows into a highly specific, inescapable command. I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche, to be of the same mind in the Lord. The room goes quiet. Everyone knows exactly who these women are. They are sitting right there. Paul wrote many letters to many churches. When the church in Corinth was a disaster of division, Paul addressed their issues, but he rarely named the individuals causing the chaos. He kept it general. But here, in his warmest letter to his most beloved church, he points a direct finger. For 2,000 years, modern readers have rushed past this moment. When we read chapter 4, verse 2, we often project our own modern assumptions onto the text. We assume this was a petty dispute, a minor church squabble over hurt feelings or personal preferences. Commentators throughout history have sometimes been cruel to Syntyche. They have reduced her to a stereotype, a difficult woman, a complainer, someone who lost sight of the gospel over a disagreement about nothing. We imagine two women bickering in the background, forever immortalized in the Bible as a symbol of petty church drama. That sounds simple. It is not a minor squabble, a severe fracture. Not two immature believers, two foundational leaders. We know this because of what Paul says next. In the very next breath, he refuses to dismiss Syntyche. He does not tell the church to ignore her. He does not tell her to step down. Instead, he defends her reputation in front of the very people who just heard her publicly corrected. He says she is a co-worker. He says her name is written in the book of life. And, most importantly, he says she contended at his side in the cause of the gospel. That is not the language of a petty disagreement. That is military language. That is athletic language. It is a description of someone who has stood on the front lines of a hostile Roman city and taken hits for the name of Jesus. When Paul says she contended at his side, he is telling the church that Syntyche has battle scars. This changes how we must read the passage. Syntyche was not a passive spectator causing trouble from the back row. She was a veteran. She was a spiritual giant in her local community. And yet, she was caught in a conflict so deep and so threatening to the church that it reached the ears of an apostle sitting in a prison cell hundreds of miles away. Why would Paul risk embarrassing a proven leader like Syntyche by naming her out loud? And how did a woman of such profound faith find herself at the center of a controversy that threatened to tear her church apart? To understand the weight of this moment, we cannot start at the end of the story. We have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a river outside the city gates, years before this letter was ever written. Because Syntyche was not just a member of the church in Philippi, she was part of the reason it was built. Around 10 years before Paul wrote his letter from a prison cell, he walked into Philippi for the very first time. It was a proud, intimidating place. Philippi was a Roman colony in the district of Macedonia. It was populated heavily by retired military veterans, designed to look and function like a miniature Rome. In most cities, Paul's strategy was simple. He would find the local Jewish synagogue and begin teaching. But Philippi did not have a synagogue. Jewish tradition required at least 10 men to establish a formal synagogue, and it seems this Roman military stronghold did not even have that. So, on the Sabbath day, as recorded in Acts chapter 16, Paul walked outside the city gates. He went down to the local river, expecting to find an informal place of prayer. He did not find a group of men. He found a gathering of women. The most famous woman in that group was a wealthy merchant named Lydia. She opened her heart to the gospel. She was baptized, and she immediately opened her large estate to Paul and his team. The church in Philippi, the very first Christian church planted on European soil, was born in a woman's home. But Lydia was not at the river alone. While the book of Acts focuses on Lydia's conversion, the letter to the Philippians fills in the rest of the picture. Euodia and Syntyche were part of the foundational fabric of this new community. They were there from the earliest days. In the ancient world, Macedonian women held a unique status. They enjoyed a level of social, public, and economic independence that was highly unusual compared to the heavily restricted women in cities like Athens or Rome. Macedonian women frequently owned property, ran successful businesses, and carried public influence. When the gospel arrived in Philippi, it was these women who fueled the mission. It was women who hosted the secret, dangerous gatherings. It was women who risked their social standing and their physical safety to align with a Jewish Messiah in a fiercely patriotic Roman colony. Syntyche was one of these women. When we read her name in chapter 4, we must not picture a passive churchgoer sitting in the back row, complaining about minor inconveniences. There were no back rows. There were no quiet, safe church buildings. There were only vulnerable, crowded house meetings, constantly under the threat of imperial suspicion. Syntyche was a builder of this church. For a decade, she had labored to keep the believers together. When Paul and Silas were stripped, beaten, and thrown into the Philippian dungeon in Acts chapter 16, the church survived because leaders like Syntyche held the line. She gave her time, her resources, and her reputation to see the truth take root in hostile soil. She was not just a participant, she was a partner. But even knowing her background as a founding member is not enough to capture the full weight of her relationship with the Apostle Paul. To truly understand why Paul's public correction in his letter is so shocking, we have to look closely at one specific Greek word he uses to describe her. Because Paul does not just say Syntyche was a helpful volunteer. He says she went to war. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 3, Paul uses a very specific phrase to describe Syntyche and her peer, Euodia. In English, it usually reads, "They contended at my side in the cause of the gospel." The translation is accurate, but English struggles to carry the full weight of the original Greek. The word Paul chooses is sunēthlēsan. It is a compound word. The root is athleo, which is where we get the English word athlete. In the ancient world, it was not used for casual recreation. It was used to describe competitors in the public games, gladiators fighting in the arena, soldiers locking shields in a Roman phalanx. It describes intense, agonizing, synchronized physical exertion against a hostile force. And the prefix, sun, means together with. Paul is not saying that Syntyche was simply a supportive church member who helped organize meals. He is saying, she went into the arena with me. To understand why this matters, you have to remember what it cost to be a Christian in Philippi. This was a city fiercely loyal to Caesar. The emperor was not just a political ruler, he was worshipped as a deity. To stand in the streets of Philippi and declare that a crucified Jewish rabbi was the true Lord of the world was not just controversial, it was treason. When Paul preached this message, the city pushed back violently. He was arrested, beaten with rods, and locked in a dungeon. And when Paul eventually had to leave the city, Syntyche stayed. She did not shrink back. She did not hide her faith. Paul says she locked shields with him. She absorbed the social and economic blows of living out the gospel in a culture that wanted to crush it. For years, she carried the weight of leadership, providing a safe harbor for the believers and continuing the mission Paul had started. She was a veteran of the faith, a spiritual heavyweight. This completely shatters our modern stereotype. We tend to view church conflict through the lens of our own comfortable experiences. We imagine arguments over carpet colors, or worship styles, or slighted egos. We project those petty assumptions onto this text, assuming Syntyche was just an immature, difficult woman. But you do not survive a decade of Roman persecution if your faith is shallow. You do not earn the title of co-worker from the Apostle Paul if you are easily offended by minor inconveniences. Syntyche was a woman of profound maturity and courage, which brings us to the deepest tension in the letter. If Syntyche was this mature, if she was this trusted, if she had proven her loyalty to Christ in the fires of persecution, why would Paul call her out? Why would he publicly name her in front of the entire congregation, knowing it would cause her embarrassment? If they were such close friends and battle-tested partners, why didn't Paul just write her a private letter to sort out the conflict? To our modern ears, Paul's public correction sounds harsh. It sounds like a breach of trust. It sounds like he is shaming a faithful leader in front of her peers, permanently ruining her reputation. But in the first century church, public correction carried a completely different meaning. Paul was not trying to humiliate Syntyche. He was trying to honor her. And to see how that is even possible, we have to look closely at what Paul deliberately leaves out of his letter. In our modern world, public correction is almost always a form of punishment. If a leader stands up in front of a crowd and calls out two people by name, we assume someone is being shamed. We assume the relationship is broken. But we have to remember how communication worked in the ancient world. When Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, he was not sending a private message. He was not mailing a newsletter that people would read quietly in their own homes. Letters from apostles were major events. They were expensive to produce and dangerous to deliver. They were carried by hand across the empire, sometimes taking weeks or months to arrive. When the messenger finally arrived in Philippi holding this parchment, the entire church would have gathered in a crowded courtyard or a large living room. The letter was read aloud, from start to finish, in one sitting. There were no private conversations. Everything in the letter was public. And this is where our modern assumptions fail us. By naming Euodia and Syntyche out loud, Paul was not humiliating them. He was honoring them. Think about how Paul handles false teachers or truly toxic people in his other letters. When someone is actively destroying the gospel, Paul often refuses to use their names. He calls them dogs or false brothers. He treats them as dangerous outsiders. But when Paul names someone directly in a letter of affection, it is a mark of profound trust. He is looking at two veteran leaders, and he is treating them with deep respect. He is not treating them like fragile volunteers who might quit if their feelings are hurt. He is treating them like field generals who have momentarily lost their focus. He expects them to be able to handle the correction. He expects them to hear their names read aloud, feel the weight of the moment, and respond with the maturity they have shown for the last 10 years. Notice carefully how he speaks to them. He says, "I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche." The Greek word he uses is parakaleo. It means to urge, to exhort, or to comfort. It is not the language of a dictator barking orders. It is the language of a pastor, begging his closest friends to remember who they are. And notice the exact repetition. He says, "I plead before Euodia," and he says, "I plead before Syntyche." He does not elevate one above the other. He does not suggest that one needs more pleading than the other. He addresses them as absolute equals. They are both vital, they are both loved, and they are both responsible for fixing the fracture. Paul knows that the church in Philippi cannot afford to lose either of them. The city is too hostile. The mission is too difficult. If these two women cannot find a way to stand together again, the entire foundation of the local church is at risk. So, he calls them out. He puts the weight of the church's future squarely on their shoulders, knowing they are strong enough to carry it. But as the congregation sits there, listening to Paul plead with these two beloved leaders, they might expect the apostle to do what any good judge would do. They might expect him to settle the debate. If two leaders are arguing, someone has to be right, and someone has to be wrong. But, as the reader continues down the parchment, something becomes obvious. Something crucial is missing from the letter. And what Paul completely leaves out changes how we view the entire argument. If you read Philippians chapter 4, looking for the cause of the argument, you will not find it. It is completely missing. Paul is writing a letter to resolve a conflict that threatens the foundation of the church in Philippi. He is an apostle. He carries authority. He knows the women involved. Yet, when he finally addresses the issue publicly, he refuses to act as a judge. He does not tell us who started the fight. He does not tell us who was right. He does not outline the grievances. He leaves the actual details of the dispute entirely blank. This is a profound pastoral choice, and it runs completely counter to human nature. When we are caught in a bitter dispute, what is our deepest desire? We want vindication. We want an authority figure to step in, look at the evidence, and tell everyone else that we are right. It is highly likely that both Euodia and Syntyche wanted exactly that. They wanted Paul to take a side. But Paul knows that if he takes a side, he creates a winner and a loser. If he reads the letter to the church and announces, Euodia is right and Syntyche must apologize, he might settle the immediate argument, but he will fracture the partnership. One woman will feel triumphant and the other will feel alienated. And as we have seen, the church in Philippi cannot afford to lose either of them. This is not about winning a debate. This is about surviving in a hostile Roman colony. So, Paul makes a deliberate choice. He treats the details of the argument as secondary to the threat of the argument. Whatever they were fighting about, whether it was a theological disagreement, a strategy for the house churches, or a deeply personal offense, Paul refuses to litigate the past. Instead, he gives them a highly specific command for the future. In English, the instruction is usually translated as, agree with each other in the Lord, or be of the same mind in the Lord. Notice the boundary Paul draws. He does not tell them to agree on everything. He does not demand that their personalities suddenly match. He does not tell them to pretend the conflict never happened. He says they must be of the same mind in the Lord. The Greek word Paul uses here for mind is phronin. It is a powerful word. It does not just mean intellectual agreement. It is not about having the exact same opinions. Phronin refers to a shared attitude, a shared direction, a shared posture of the heart. Paul is telling Syntyche that her unity with Euodia cannot be built on who wins the argument. It must be built on their shared allegiance to Jesus. The ground they stand on is not their personal preference. The ground they stand on is the Lord. They do not have to see eye to eye on the details, but they must look in the same direction. But telling two angry, hurt, veteran leaders to just have the same mind sounds like empty pastoral advice. To anyone who has ever been in a severe conflict, it sounds impossible. How do you actually do that when the hurt is real? How do you lay down your need for vindication? Paul does not leave them guessing. He does not expect Syntyche to figure this out on her own, because the phrase he uses, this command to have the same mind, is not a new idea in this letter. Paul has already given Syntyche the exact blueprint for how to survive this conflict. He wrote it down 2 chapters earlier. When Paul tells Syntyche and Euodia to be of the same mind, he is doing something brilliant. He is not introducing a new rule. He is pointing back to a song the church already knows. In the 2nd chapter of this very same letter, Paul writes what many scholars believe is an early Christian hymn. It is one of the most famous and beautiful passages in the entire New Testament. In chapter 2, verse 5, Paul tells the church, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus." The Greek word used there for mindset is phronin. It is the exact same word Paul uses in chapter 4 when he addresses Syntyche. He tells her to phronin, in the Lord, to have the same mind. When the letter is read aloud in the Philippian living room, the church hears the echo. When Paul tells Syntyche to have the same mind, everyone in the room knows exactly what mind he is talking about, because Paul has just spent chapter 2 describing it. He describes how Jesus existed in the very nature of God, but did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Instead, he emptied himself. He took the nature of a servant. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. This changes everything about how we understand Paul's command to Syntyche. Paul is not asking her to compromise. Compromise is a negotiation. Compromise is when two people sit down, argue their points, and both agree to give up 10% so they can meet in the middle. Compromise is about protecting your rights while settling a dispute. Paul is not asking for a negotiation. He is asking for an emptying. Philippi was a Roman colony. and Roman culture was obsessed with status, honor, and public reputation. In the Roman mind, to lower yourself voluntarily was not considered a virtue. It was considered pathetic. If you had power, you used it. If you were offended, you demanded your honor back. Syntyche was a veteran leader. She had social standing. She had fought for the gospel. It is highly likely that in this dispute, she felt justified. She probably had a right to be angry. But Paul points her to Jesus. He is essentially saying, Syntyche, Jesus had all the rights of heaven. He had all the honor of God. But he did not cling to it. He let it go to bring peace. You must do the same. Paul is asking Syntyche to lay down her right to be right. He is asking her to absorb the offense, lower herself, and become a servant to the very woman she is arguing with. That is not a minor church administrative fix. That is a crucifixion of the ego. It is one of the hardest things a human being can ever be asked to do. When you have been hurt, when you are convinced you are correct, laying down your defense feels like a kind of death. And Paul knows this. He knows that standing up to a Roman magistrate is hard, but sometimes standing down to a fellow believer is even harder. He knows that Syntyche might not have the strength to cross the room and make peace while the wounds are still fresh. So, Paul does something deeply pastoral. He does not just give a command and walk away. He knows that healing a fracture of this size requires a bridge, and he does not expect Syntyche to build that bridge alone. In the very next sentence, Paul turns his attention away from the two women, and he calls for backup. In the very next sentence, Paul turns his attention away from Syntyche and Euodia, and he speaks directly to someone else in the room. He says, "Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel." Who is this true companion? For centuries, scholars have debated the identity of this mysterious person. Some believe it was a specific leader in the Philippian church, perhaps Epaphroditus, or Silas, or Luke. Others suggest the Greek word used here, syzygos, was actually a proper name, and Paul was speaking directly to a man named Syzygos. But whether it was a specific name or a descriptive title, the meaning of the Greek word is exactly the same. Syzygos literally means yokefellow. It describes two animals, usually oxen, bound together by a heavy wooden yoke to pull a plow. If one pulls to the left and the other pulls to the right, the work stops. The heavy machinery of the harvest grinds to a halt. The only way forward is to pull in the exact same direction, to have the same mind. By calling on a loyal yokefellow, Paul is revealing a profound truth about how the early church functioned. He knows that when two leaders are locked in a deep, painful dispute, simply telling them to fix it is rarely enough. The emotional labor of forgiveness is heavy. Laying down your pride is exhausting. When a fracture is this severe, two people often do not have the strength to heal it entirely on their own. They need help. So, Paul activates the community. He does not tell the rest of the church to mind their own business. In our modern culture, we often treat conflict as a highly private, individual issue. We expect people to work things out behind closed doors and only return to the community when they are ready to smile again. But the biblical model of reconciliation is communal. Paul is asking a trusted, mature believer to step in and help carry the weight of this healing. He is asking this yokefellow to come alongside Syntyche and Euodia, not to act as a judge and not to litigate their past arguments. He is asking this companion to help them remember who they are, to help them find the mind of Christ, to help them align their shoulders so they can carry the heavy plow of the gospel once again. Notice the profound pastoral care in this moment. Paul is not scolding Syntyche and abandoning her to figure it out alone. He is wrapping the strength of the local church around her. He is ensuring that she is supported, protected, and actively guided back into unity. And he reminds the yokefellow exactly why these women are worth the effort. He repeats his defense of them. He says, "Help them, because they have contended at my side." He is essentially telling the church, do not let them fail. Do not let this argument be the end of their story. They have fought too hard for this community. They have suffered too much for the name of Jesus. Go to them, sit with them, and help them find their way back to each other. This is not a story about a petty church squabble. It is a masterclass in Christian peacemaking. It is a portrait of an apostle who loved his frontline co-workers too much to let them be destroyed by division. But there is one final detail in this text. It is a small historical reality that brings this entire letter full circle. It is a detail that changes Syntyche from a forgotten name in a quiet verse into a profound testament to the grace of God. And it has to do with what her name actually means. In the ancient Greek language, the name Syntyche is built from two root words. The prefix is syn, meaning with or together, and the root is tyche, which translates to chance, fate, or luck. In the Roman world, it was a relatively common name that essentially meant a fortunate encounter, or good luck. But when Paul writes the final words of his appeal to her, he makes sure the entire congregation knows that Syntyche's legacy has nothing to do with random chance or Roman fate. After asking the loyal yokefellow to help these two women, Paul writes this: "Help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life." That final phrase is not a casual sign-off. It is a profound declaration of identity. Remember where this church is located. Philippi was a premier Roman colony. In that culture, being a Roman citizen was the greatest status a human being could hold. Citizens had their names recorded in the official civic registers. That written record guaranteed their rights, their protection, and their public honor. But by aligning with a crucified Jewish king, Syntyche had likely forfeited her social standing. Her name was likely whispered in the streets with suspicion. She was experiencing the profound, daily friction of living as a citizen of heaven in a colony of Rome. So Paul reminds her, and the whole church, where her name is permanently recorded. Her identity is not secured in the temporary, fragile ledgers of a Roman colony. Her name is written in the eternal book of life. She belongs to God, and she belongs to this community. For centuries, modern history has often been unkind to Syntyche. We have read Philippians chapter 4 and remembered her only for her worst moment. We have used her as a cautionary tale. We have imagined her as a petty, difficult woman who lost sight of the mission over a minor disagreement. But the biblical text simply does not allow us to leave her there. When we look closely at the words Paul actually uses, the stereotype falls apart, and a completely different portrait emerges. We do not see a passive complainer. We see a founding mother of the first church in Europe. We do not see a fragile volunteer. We see a spiritual athlete who stood shoulder to shoulder with the Apostle Paul, absorbing the violent pushback of a Roman stronghold. Syntyche reminds us that deep, painful conflict in the church is not a modern invention, and it is not always the result of shallow faith. Sometimes, the most intense fractures happen between the most committed, battle-tested leaders. The heavy plow of the gospel is difficult to pull, and under the severe pressure of a hostile world, even the strongest yokefellows can lose their alignment. Paul's letter to Syntyche teaches us that the gospel does not expect us to be flawless people who never argue. It expects us to be humble people who know how to empty ourselves when we do. It calls us to lay down our right to be right, to absorb the cost of peace, and to put on the mind of Christ. Syntyche was never just a name in a forgotten church argument. She was the living proof that even in our deepest conflicts, the grace of God is strong enough to hold us together.